to me, it's just such a myopic vision of what it means to respect somebody's rights, right? I mean, the right to direct one's own medical care is important, but sometimes important rights come into conflict with other rights. They're the basic human rights. And when the illness is preventing a person from recognizing what their needs are, when it's interfering with a person's ability to recognize what's happening to them, essentially we're discriminating against people. We're depriving them care because of their illness itself.
Almost 2 years ago, we interviewed Brian Stettin, the senior advisor to New York City Mayor Eric Adams, on severe mental illness, about that city's compassionate intervention program to get people off the streets and into much needed treatment. Almost 2 years later, Brian returns to tell us how the program's going, what successes have happened, and what the challenges still are. Welcome to our podcast, Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. From the place where schizophrenia and real life collide. East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. With Miriam Feldman, Mindy Greiling, and Randy Kay. Well, a very happy new year. This is our first episode of 2025. We are Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. Three moms in the trenches of having sons with schizophrenia. We've each written best-selling books about our experience there to help you, and this is our fifth season of this podcast. So thank you for listening. And there's, a lot in the news to talk about, but I do want to mention that Mimi is in Los Angeles right now, where the wildfires are kind of scary. So can you just catch us up a bit on that, Mimi? You go down there frequently. You don't live there full time, but you're near the fire, so you may cut in and out. Is that what's happening?
There we go. I'm sorry. Can you say it cut out?
That's okay. Yeah. So you're in the midst of the fires. You're not in it, but close, and it's a scary time.
And, I'm from here. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen it this bad, this close into the city. Usually things are out there in the canyons and things like that, and it's not only closer to the city but in 2 or 3 disparate places. So it's a lot. It's scary. I personally know 3 or 4 people already who have lost their house.
It's so, and I have a lot of friends out there who are in the voiceover and radio and acting business as well, who have basically said, yeah, we got our dogs and our cats and the people that matter, but we've lost our studio and our house so far. So it's kind of odd that we're talking about the homeless tonight, since so many people, obviously they have friends to stay with, I hope, and so forth, but it's a very scary time. I have just started a new permanent job as the All Things Considered host on a local NPR affiliate, and so as the local host, many of the stories today were about the fire, and our heart goes out to everybody out there. And, in the midst of all this, thank you for joining us, Mimi. I'm glad you're here. And if you cut in and out, we'll certainly understand. Right. So
congratulations, Randy. We're very proud of you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really nice. I've been filling in on that station for a long time. It's in case you're interested, it's WSHU in Connecticut. It's an NPR affiliate. You can always hear me on WSHU.org. I'm on from, let's just say 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern time, and pretty much every weekday. And I'm learning a lot about the news always. So, and in the news a lot recently is homelessness. If you listen to the podcast, you know that my son, Ben, is on the verge of homelessness and still is. And a couple of years ago, I can't believe it's almost 2 years ago, we had Brian Stettin, who is senior advisor to New York City Mayor Eric Adams, on the podcast to talk about a new program at the time to get more severely mentally ill, generally homeless people off the streets and into hospitals for psychiatric evaluation, with or without their consent. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'm using air quotes. I recently wrote an article for Substack asking journalists to stop saying against their will, because as we've said many times on this podcast, if some person with Alzheimer's was wandering the street, in a nightgown and slippers wandering and clearly has dementia, that person would get help. But someone with a severe mental illness who is homeless, you hear all the time, oh, we can't bring them in against their will. And so I question in that article, well, what is their will if they don't know what their will is? We talk about on this podcast, and certainly in many circles, they talk about anosognosia, the fact that people with severe mental illness often don't know they're ill because their frontal lobes are impaired. And so that kind of takes against their will to a different plane. And I'm asking journalists to stop using that term. And so, anyway, with that said, we were so delighted to have Brian Stettin on episode 61. You can certainly go back and hear that. But a lot has been in the news lately, especially in New York City. And in response to a lot of this, New York Governor Kathy Hochul has made it very clear that she wants to continue to enforce this plan to revamp care and strengthen New York's involuntary commitment laws. And so with that in mind, we welcome back Brian Stettin. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Randy, Mindy, Mimi, so great to be with you again. I should
Yeah,
turn
go
the
ahead and
camera
turn
on.
your camera back on. We
Okay,
want to
sorry
see your
about
face.
that. Missed my cue there. Sorry about that.
There you are. Thank you so much for joining us again. You know, we know when we interviewed you a couple of years ago, you know, there was no, you had just started and you had some good stories to tell us, people who had been reunited with families and gotten into treatment. And so we wanted to bring you back in the light of how much New York in particular has been in the news with this woman, Debrina Kawam, who had spent time in a homeless shelter and was sleeping on the subway and was tragically set on fire by somebody else, Sebastian Zapata, I believe his name was. And then earlier than that, Luigi Mangione, who may or may not have had mental illness, we don't know yet, who committed murder of a CEO of United Healthcare, and also the story of Jordan Neely, who died by vigilante chokehold. So the homeless in New York City has been in the news a lot, and now the governor coming out going, hey, Kendra's Law, which you helped to write, we have to strengthen it and enforce it. So I want to know about that, but before that, I'd like to know how the plan that you instituted almost 2 years ago is going.
Sure. We have a long way to go. We are very far from mission accomplished and kind of changing the culture of our mental health system and achieving better results for people who are in psychiatric crisis, roaming our streets and subways. But I think we've come a long way. When we last spoke, we were only really a few months into those culture changing efforts. And at that point, we had really been focused primarily on puncturing a pervasive myth that had so long stood in the way of people getting care. We were literally, for years, for decades, we're walking away from people encountered in psychiatric crisis. And I'm talking about the folks who we actually have on the ground responsible for bringing people to the hospital under law that we've had for a long time that gives that authority to police officers and certain clinicians to bring them to a hospital for an evaluation where a psychiatrist can make a decision about whether that person should be admitted. And the standard upon which they were operating in New York is unfortunately kind of vaguely written. And for a long time, this notion of danger to self or others, there had been a very narrow understanding of what the danger to self part of that meant. And this is something we talked about the last time I was on, where we were really most focused on making the professionals who we rely on to interpret this law understand that danger to self is not simply about a person being suicidal or engaging in some outrageously dangerous conduct or being at some imminent risk of harm, because the word imminent does not appear in our law. It also encompasses the notion of a person who is, because of mental illness, not meeting their basic human survival needs, food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. So that person who's just in deplorable condition, again, it has to be coupled with them demonstrating some symptoms of mental illness. Those are folks who, really should be coming to the hospital for evaluation, many of whom we can actually help. But because of this misunderstanding of the law. There had been for a long time just been this belief that we can't do anything for this person because they're not suicidal, threatening to harm anybody, or jumping into traffic. And so those early months were really kind of about countering that misunderstanding, right? Delivering training to our outreach teams and to police and to the doctors that we have in our city operated hospitals to make them actually understand what courts had said about this vaguely worded law, which, we also would like to have clarified and made more explicit. We can talk about that in a little bit later. But those were that's kind of where we were at that time, is just really at the beginning of changing that understanding, and also kind of developing new protocols to clarify roles in the in the involuntary removal process, so that police and EMS would understand, for example, that if a clinician is leading the removal, it's not a collaboration, it's not a decision they have a say in, that clinician's word is meant to be followed. We were developing course protocols to make sure that the people who were most worried about were directed to our city operated hospitals rather than private hospitals, so that we would have a little bit more involvement in how they what kind of treatment they got going forward and what we were able to connect them to. And so, we were very excited about that, and we're starting to see some early results of that change in understanding. I think what we've really seen in almost 2 years since is a lot of fruit that's been born from that change in understanding of the law. One place we're really seeing this vividly is in how folks are doing that are on our top 50 lists. We maintain
what's a top 50 list?
Yeah, sure. We have something called the Coordinated Behavioral Health Task Force. That's the official name of it. And this is a team that represents all of the agencies that have a role in meeting the needs of people with untreated mental illness, right? So that's our Department of Health that provides a lot of services. It's our Department of Homeless Services that provides shelter to people. It's our city operated hospital system, and it's our state partners and our outreach nonprofit partners that actually are on the ground interacting with people. And we, through those teams, have identified really 2 top 50 lists traditionally, right? We have one for the clients who are most entrenched in our subway system, who we know are believed to have severe mental illness, another one for people who are entrenched in street and park locations. And we have 2 separate meetings for each of these top 50 lists weekly, where we actually walk through each of these individuals and kind of figure out where we are with them and what the next step is to get them to the place we want them in, which is, of course, ultimately permanent supportive housing. These are people who have just been extremely resistant to our efforts to get them to come inside and work with us. And that's how they wind up on the list. And these lists have existed for some time. It was actually something created really constructively by the prior administration, Mayor de Blasio.
Wait, so it's actually a list
of
homeless people that you've
right.
identified and cases that you're trying to keep up with and reconnect with, and okay.
Yeah, that's right. Well, as I say, we have 2 of those lists, and we've actually started a third one now for people who are kind of entrenched in our mental health shelters and having trouble getting out of them. But yeah, these are folks who we know very well, right? Who we, have been kind of stuck in the revolving door of the system, maybe have been to jail or the hospital a couple of times, so that we know quite a bit about them. And these are folks who we see regularly at certain locations where they, have chosen to remain. New York City is a right to shelter city, right? So anybody who is remaining unsheltered and homeless is doing so because they have made a choice that they, I'll put choice in quotes, but
Right.
they have rejected the opportunity to come inside. And that makes
You
New
said
York
you
very
know
different
them a
than
lot.
a place like LA. Excuse me?
You said these 50, 100, 150
Yeah.
people well. Do you know how many of them have families still involved?
Very few. Many of them, New York City is kind of a magnet city that draws a lot of people from elsewhere. So even those who are from New York have very often burned their bridges with family. It's certainly one of the tools we try to bring to bear in solving these problems, is trying to figure out if there are family members we can get in touch with, if we have their permission to share information with those family members. And so certainly some of the success we've had has been in reconnecting people with family. But, sadly, many of these are folks who have kind of lost their connections, burned bridges, and just reached a situation where family members are not in touch with them anymore.
This is one of my bugaboos. I'm really glad you're doing this. I strongly support what you're doing. And I also think you're dealing with the tip top of the iceberg. And I see this same thing in Dade County, Miami-Dade, where we had Judge Leifman on as one of our guests as well. And it sounds like he's dealing, there with the same population that you're dealing with, the frequent flyers, the people that people come to know and really need to get help for them, because otherwise, they're in the way, they're causing problems, and they're, the sickest of the sick. But exactly. I also am hoping that what you're doing eventually will branch out to being maybe 500 people, so that the kind of people that we hear from often do still have family members, and they're stuck with people also with anosognosia who are on the way to being, estranged from their families, or at least their families are getting exhausted. And they also are gravely disabled. They're not dangerous to self or others, but they're dangerous to themselves because they're gravely disabled. And that population, is there any plan in New York to encompass them, or are you always going to just be busy with the tip of the iceberg?
Yeah, I think what would be a real game changer in our ability to reach that larger population you're speaking of before they become homeless would be to establish a psychiatric deterioration standard in our civil commitment law, right? To make it possible to identify psychiatric harm, not just serious physical harm, as grounds for intervention, which is something, as you know, that half the states have on the books, Minnesota among them. And it makes a huge difference in your ability to react to somebody's needs before they become homeless. Unfortunately, with the law we are really kind of stuck using it in situations where it's apparent that somebody is suffering some severe physical deprivation as a result of their non-treatment. And so that makes it harder to be proactive in situations you described tragically. We are very much waiting for people to if they're not threatening violence against anybody, if they're only a harm to themselves, we are often waiting for them to reach the point where they've kind of lost it all, which is awful and ridiculous.
Is this change in part of what Governor Hochul is hoping to advocate for?
Right. So we've had a legislative package out for about a year and a half now called the Supportive Interventions Act, which is our wholesale attempt to fix all the flaws and gaps in the mental hygiene law, that section of the law the chapter that we use to provide involuntary treatment for those who need it. And so that is an element of our legislative package, which has been kind of sitting idly in the legislature through the prior session. The great news about Governor Hochul is that what she's announcing now, in effect, is that she is getting behind these ideas that we have put forward previously. She's joining the bandwagon, which we are delighted about. And we have not seen the specific language she has in mind. We hope it's going to look a lot like ours. Those discussions are ongoing, but conceptually, she has already gotten behind many of the ideas that are in that package. That one in particular is not something she has said specifically. The idea of adding a psychiatric deterioration standard to the law is not something we've heard from her that she's interested in doing. But hope springs eternal. I certainly think it would be important. Let me just say, though, about the top 50 list, point I was kind of getting around to, is that we have seen a huge difference since instituting this culture change in how many people we are able to help from those lists and bring in off the street. We did an analysis where we looked at as I said, the top 50 lists are pre-existing. We looked at the year prior to our training folks on how to interpret the standard more broadly, and found that there were 21 cases where people came off the top 50 list because we connected them to temporary housing or permanent housing. We got them on the path towards permanent housing, or got them into a hospital situation that where that would ultimately result in them getting into housing. So 21 people is, it's not a meaningless number. It's a significant accomplishment, and it shows that there are other means that we bring to bear to help people get off those lists, even when we were interpreting the law narrowly. But in the year that followed, so from late 23 to late 24, we managed to bring 54 people off those two top 50 lists. So that's 145% increase. And again, there are many reasons for that, but a greater willingness to use involuntary removal is a huge part of that. There had been 5 times we had done involuntary removals with people on the top 50 list in that prior year, and we did it 30 times in the next year. So that's a 6-fold increase.
And where did those people end up?
Well, we direct them to our city-operated hospitals, so that's where they go first. Many of them need an extended period of hospital care. That's another thing that we've really kind of been working on, is making sure that we don't discharge people prematurely and expect good results when we haven't actually fully dealt with stabilizing them in a significant way and getting the meds right. So we have a partnership with the state hospital system. They've really been great partners in producing a new unit at the Manhattan Psych Center, which is a state hospital on Randall's Island in New York City, where they've created what they call the Transition to Housing Unit, the THU. First, it was 25 beds, and then they increased it to 50 beds. And so for folks who have needed extended hospital care, we have directed many of them to that THU. And, the nice thing about having someone in the hospital for a few months, and it's, 4 months or more that they typically stay in the THU, is that it gives us enough time to discharge them directly to permanent supportive housing.
Wow.
Rather than discharge them to a shelter, because we're still working on the housing and we hope that they're going to stick around in the shelter, which, are not as nice places as we'd like them to be. And it's not surprising that people often leave before, we can get that permanent housing unit available. But keeping that person in a hospital for a number of months, the primary reason we're doing it is because it really does take that long to help a person kind of learn those basic habits of self-care, and get the meds right. But an excellent additional benefit of that is it gives us enough time to discharge them directly to permanent supportive housing. And we've seen that happen with a number of individuals that we've brought in over the last 2 years, and there's nothing more gratifying.
You mentioned Minnesota, and so I just have to say, we do have a really good law, as you know, but we don't implement it well.
Yeah.
And one of the big bugaboos is we don't have the capacity in our system. So will be very curious to see what your governor supports, because she will be looking at the state budget, and we all know what's right. It's to keep people in the hospital for months and to not discharge them to shelters, but to send them to good care housing where they get the support they need. So we know that in Minnesota, that in New York City, but why we don't do it here in Minnesota is not because we don't know it, it's because we don't have anywhere to put people. So we also will only be dealing with the really tip of the iceberg, because they actually fill up the whole capacity that we have. It's almost impossible to get into supportive housing here unless you are on the street, very, very ill, or, using substances. So I'll be watching your governor's proposal. What she might know is right, and what she wants to propose to be paid for could be 2 different things.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And it's a huge challenge here as well. And look, this is a system that's been neglected for decades, and it's not going to be reversed overnight. I mean, the resources that we need to flood mental health with are not nearly as controversial as the stuff we're talking about, right? We have consensus among all the advocates that we need lots more of all kinds of good stuff, including permanent supportive housing, but also clubhouses and treatment teams on the ground. And I do think we've reversed direction. I mean, I'm seeing that even in the last couple of years, the tide has turned. We are doing a lot to bring those resources to bear, but it's gradual, it's incremental, and it's going to take years. And as that starts to happen, we're going to be able to do a whole lot more with these, changes in the law that we're talking about and the changes in the understanding of the law. In the meantime, as you say, we're kind of triaging and we're focusing on the people who are most visible and most heartbreaking, and the people that we kind of see every day on the streets and subways. And so
the issue of violence, do you think that will inspire more politicians in New York to support these proposals? Unfortunately, that is, I think, an impetus.
Yeah.
Public rises up and then people are expected to do something. How do you think that will play out?
There's no question about it. It is sad, and it doesn't speak well of human nature, perhaps, but it's the way it's always worked. I certainly saw that time and time again at the Treatment Advocacy Center, that for years when I was policy director there, we would be plugging away at trying to change the law of a state, get nowhere year after year, and then some major tragedy would hit the news, and suddenly lawmakers would take interest. And Kendra's law in New York is certainly an example of that. People had been talking about it. DJ Jaffe had been talking about the need for outpatient commitment, hadn't been called AOT yet, for many years before that. And I think it has a lot to do with why we're in a moment now that the legislative proposal that we put out almost 2 years ago is, suddenly getting some traction and drawing.
Yeah. I'm really glad that Mimi brought up, what happens to them afterwards, because in doing some follow-up research, when I wrote my article on Substack, I'm so supportive of what you're doing, and anybody you help is somebody that wasn't helped before. But I noticed the pushback that you were getting and you are getting, and I took umbrage at the against their will, and even people who are supposedly supporting these initiatives are like, get the dangerously mentally ill off the streets. Well, what about the vulnerable mentally ill?
Yeah.
So that's why I want a word change there too. My son is not a dangerous, I don't think yet, who knows, but he's vulnerable. He's so vulnerable. And I love the redefinition of, psychiatric, what'd you call it?
Deterioration.
Deterioration.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But a lot of what the frustration I read about and I know about is, well, we finally get them off the street and then we can't find them a bed. And then we find them a bed and they're discharged in 2 days when they say they want to leave. So to me, to hear about a 4-month hospitalization where maybe they have a chance to maybe form community a little bit, does that ever happen?
Certainly, I think it's an aspect of the treatment that's being provided at the THU. I think they do try and do some, group activities where they're trying to engage people. It's not everybody's interested in participating in that. You got to meet people where they are.
Right.
But certainly a big part of discharge planning in New York is the clubhouse model. Fountain House started here, and it's a huge asset to New York, and we're trying to replicate that model. We're trying to establish lots of fountain houses with their involvement. Our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene put out a proposal last year, request for proposals for nonprofits to start more clubhouses and increase the footprint of that important opportunity for people to have community. I certainly agree that it's a big part of how we keep people engaged in treatment.
What kind of, I know you're getting budget challenges and budget pushback. Are you still getting stigma and emotional pushback from people when you think about strengthening these laws? Like, what is Governor Hochul going to face as she finally puts her voice behind supporting this. Like, what are you hearing on the other side of the coin?
There are still advocates out there who are going to, not lay down for these changes in the law, who I think with good intentions. I don't think they mean harm. But they kind of value the right to refuse treatment above all else. I mean, to them, it's the ultimate way we respect somebody's dignity and selfhood is by giving them the authority to make decisions about their own health care, unless and until they reach a moment where they are harming somebody else or suicidal. And to me, it's just such a myopic vision of what it means to respect somebody's rights, right? I mean, the right to direct one's own medical care is important, but sometimes important rights come into conflict with other rights. The basic human rights
Well,
of
and not only that,
living with dignity. Yeah.
we put this thing onto people with mental illness, but we as a society exercise those rights with other people. Babies and children
Yeah.
are as human as anyone else.
That's
They
right.
can't make their own decisions. Old people with dementia don't make their own decisions. I mean,
Yeah.
we recognize that. It's not like there's not an example of it, and yet somehow we create this caveat for people with brain disease.
Yeah, it's so true, and I can't explain that. The other way I kind of look at it is just the basic civil right of not being discriminated against on the basis of an illness, right? That's a basic concept of the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, right? That's a statutory right that every American has. And when the illness is preventing a person from recognizing what their needs are, when it's interfering with a person's ability to recognize what's happening to them, essentially we're discriminating against people. We're depriving them care because of their illness itself.
Exactly.
So, I really feel like the way to address that argument is to kind of flip the script on it. I don't see myself as pushing back against civil rights. I see our side of this argument as being the way to champion civil rights.
They haven't bonded with the issue. I love that phrase that you used on our last program. Those of us who have worked on it or know this issue personally, we bond with this issue. We had a guest on it that his name was Daryl Herman, and he's a person with schizophrenia, and he made the case when he was on our program that people with mental illnesses who haven't had psychosis, maybe they've actually even heard voices as part of their illness, but they actually haven't been psychotic, have no business then speaking for those who have, because they don't understand a break from reality, because they've never themselves broken from reality. And our policymakers tend to deal with people who are healthy enough to show up, and hence they probably don't have as much experience, if any, with psychosis. What do you think?
And yet they purport to speak for the people who these laws are designed to serve.
Exactly.
No, you're right.
Brian, can you share with us a story of one of these top 50? You don't have to reveal a name. Obviously,
Sure.
you can couch it in anonymity, but can you share sort of what does this success look like under this program?
Yeah, and I'm happy to, because one jumps to mind. So I should say that one of the ways we have put this policy change into practice is by deploying more teams that are really focused on looking for people, particularly in the subways, who are not meeting their basic needs and also displaying mental illness symptoms. And so we have really leaned into the co-response model, where we pair clinicians with police officers to work in small teams. Police officer gives that clinician a greater sense of safety and engaging with people who might otherwise they may be a little wary of, and of course are really very handy to have on the scene in a moment a clinician decides a person needs to come to the hospital, because that really does take a police officer to effectuate that removal. We don't have to wait for them because they're already there. So we have established a couple of programs in the subway system, one in partnership with the MTA, the Transit Authority's Police Department, called Scout, another one with the New York City Police Department called PATH. But I myself was riding the train going to work. This was, I guess, right around the time. No, it would have been in early 2024. So about a year after I talked to you last. And I saw, as I often do, as many New Yorkers often do, somebody in obvious psychiatric crisis, a person who was surrounded by a whole lot of stuff. People had given him a wide berth, basically a whole half of the train car to himself while he was muttering. And he was obviously in terrible physical condition. It was just a classic example of why we have these scout teams on the ground. Using my phone, I was able to get in touch with the scout team that we had working in Manhattan that day to say that I'm riding the train and I'll stay with him as long as it takes for you guys to get over here and evaluate him. That team includes, a nurse who's authorized to make an assessment whether the person should go to the hospital. And so I got in touch with him at 59th Street, Columbus Circle. He actually wound up getting off the train at 34th Street, which made it easier for us to get the scout team there. And we were able to get the team there in time. The nurse did an assessment and determined that he met the criteria. He was exhibiting symptoms and was a danger to himself. He wound up spending 8 months in the hospital, the first month of which was in the city-operated hospital, Bellevue, that he first went to, and then he was transferred to the THU, that state unit I talked about where people can stay for longer. 8 months later, he came out into permanent supportive housing, and it went exactly as planned. And I actually had an opportunity to visit with him just a few weeks ago. He's been in this housing unit on the Upper West Side, not far from where I live, just about 2 months now. And he's doing great and just remarkable transformation. He doesn't have a lot. He doesn't say a lot. He's kind of inwardly directed. But the difference in his demeanor is unbelievable. And, in fact, he is actually someone who, even before I realized shortly after I first encountered him, that day on the train, I realized he's someone who I had actually seen quite a bit near City Hall, gesticulating wildly and talking into a toy microphone, and not really posing any particular danger to anybody, but just somebody people kind of sped up as they walked past. He's had 2 great months, and has reconnected with family.
Wow.
And so, in fact, I learned he spent Thanksgiving with family for the first time in years. So, that's exactly why we're doing this. We hope to have a whole lot more of those stories to tell. And, we have a handful at this point.
It would be so wonderful if at any point when they're ready and any of these people would be willing to tell their stories, because they come from such a lower, like we have so many successfully recovering people on our podcast. Some of them have sunk this low, but many have not. To hear, but even hearing about it is
Yeah, and I don't know if
great.
you do like show notes for your podcast, but where you can give people links to articles. Andy Newman at the Times did a fantastic story last summer called, the headline was, he was handcuffed and hospitalized. Now he's on a path to housing, and it was about another individual
Awesome.
named Mazu Mankalia, who was brave and willing to tell his story to the world.
Well, send me the links. I'll put them in the show notes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Randy does wonderful show notes. I think if people who are resisting helping people that need help and don't know they need it, if they could see the finished product, so to speak, as your story illustrated, I think that would change a lot of minds. That film that Mimi worked on, Into the Light, that's aptly named, people that were doing really poorly, but they came into the light because they got clozapine as part of the message of that one, but also the proper supports and everything. I just think that part of why people think just let them be there, let them live like that because that's their choice.
Yeah.
I think they also inside believe that's the best they can do.
It's so true. It's so true.
There, I mean, my own son, I believe right now that's what he's going through. Like you know, you lower the bar, you lower the bar, you lower the bar, and you just say, "Oh, I guess I can do this." It's
Yeah.
at what point does somebody say, "Okay, this is psychiatric deterioration, and this person needs help." And even though he didn't show up to court when he was supposed to, so there's a warrant for his arrest, let's get him help first and worry about that later. You know, there are situations that are so difficult. What, Brian, what can people do? Like, what are the next steps? What has to happen next? What are the ways to get laws like Kendra's law in New York and similar laws in other states? Many states have these laws and they're not enforced, or they don't have the housing. And they, as Mindy was saying, they don't have the housing, they don't have the resources, they don't have the facilities. So that's a tall order. I get that. But you know, what are the next steps in your situation for this to work, to continue to work and to work even better? What can people do to help?
Well, certainly people in New York who are hearing this can urge their lawmakers to support the Supportive Interventions Act, right? This legislation we've talked a little about, because it really is designed to unlock our ability to do a whole lot more on this agenda than we currently are able to do. Part of it we've mentioned, right? Making explicit in the law that failure to meet your basic needs when it results from mental illness is a way of being dangerous to yourself. To once and for all end that debate so that we will not face even some of the resistance we still do from some of the folks on the ground who are interpreting this law, to allow us to take it to the next level by putting in that psychiatric deterioration standard so that we don't have to wait till people are in the most pathetic circumstances before we can help them. We have important things in that legislation that is going to allow us to get more hospital beds online. We want to empower psychiatric nurse practitioners to make decisions when they're on the staff of a hospital, to actually make a decision to admit people and to come to court and provide that testimony. For one thing, that's going to lead to a lot less clogging in our psychiatric emergency rooms. We have specialized what we call CPEPs in our hospitals, emergency rooms that are specifically for psychiatric evaluation. We don't have a lot of psychiatrists. We are staffing these units mostly with psychiatric nurse practitioners who do wonderful work, but the law does not allow them to do the evaluations. And so that leads to, a backlog, basically. It leads to the CPEPs getting clogged because we're reliant on the few psychiatrists there to perform this important function. It also has a lot to do with why we can't open more beds. It's not just about the money to establish the beds. It's also about finding the people to staff them. And when we are so inefficiently staffing these units because the few psychiatrists we have are spending so much time doing evaluations and running to court, that's a huge drag on our ability to open beds. Another big piece of that legislative package that I think will make a huge difference is to make it part of the standard of care for inpatient hospitalization that a person be screened for AOT, which we've mentioned a little, Kendra's law, right? The opportunity for court-ordered outpatient treatment when you come out of the hospital, if you are in fact someone who's been stuck in that revolving door and has been hospitalized a few times because of your difficulty adhering to treatment. Right now, we have hospitals that do a great job making referrals to us that a patient they're about to discharge needs AOT, and we get those folks into the program. But we also have hospitals that just don't make the referrals. And so they're actually discharging people who meet AOT criteria, who our program never finds out about. And that's got to end, right? So to make more use of AOT, we need all hospitals to participate by just simply screening their patients. It should be a no-brainer. So those are just a few of the things that we're trying to address in that legislative package. I could do a whole hour on it. But another thing that I would say that really needs to happen is that we need better options for people to be discharged to when they're not, we don't have that housing available to them yet, right? Because there's a lot of people that come out of the hospital just receiving acute care rather than extended care. It's not realistic to think we're going to have them in housing on the day they come out. And so when we're discharging people to shelters, it's no surprise that we're often losing them back to the street very soon thereafter. And we're actually about to announce a major proposal on a new model we want to create to make sure that we can keep people on the radar when they come out of hospitals. But at that point, at that moment, it's got to be a voluntary option, because these are folks who are being discharged because we no longer have grounds to hold them in the hospital. And so we have to make the places we can send people to more attractive than a barracks style shelter that can be pretty scary and unpleasant and often has very rigid rules. We need what we call safe haven type housing, right? Where people have private rooms or semi-private space, more lax rules on when they can come and go. But critically, intensive psychiatric services provided on premises. And that's something that doesn't really exist yet and needs to, and we're committed to making it happen.
All right. We are actually running out of time very soon. I want to make sure, and if you don't live in New York State, these are issues that are in all the other 49 states as well, some more than others. So Mimi, Mindy, any last thoughts or questions?
I have a question, because what's sticking in my mind is this word imminent. Because I remember when my son first got sick, the big thing that I'm in California, was of imminent danger or harm to others. I don't know if that word is still in there, but that was what kept getting thrown back at me every time that I would try and get him in the hospital. So that word is not in the wording in New York.
It's not in New York's law, and I can tell you from the years I spent at TAC that we have succeeded in getting that removed from most of the state laws that added it back in the 60s and 70s. And there are a couple of places left that still speak of imminent risk of harm, but for the most part, it's something that's just exists in people's minds.
Yeah, because it was such a restrictive, impossible thing to meet.
Yeah. It basically means you have to be at death's door. We have to time the intervention at the exact moment when you're about to face near certain death. And obviously that's not
orchestrate several of those.
Yeah, right. So it means you have to let people get sicker, right? And let them get more psychotic.
It's crazy.
And we have so many studies that tell us that the duration of untreated psychosis matters so much that we don't have the luxury of waiting around and hoping we're going to catch that person at a moment, at that special moment, and not have them fall into the clutches of the criminal justice system. But even if we do catch them at that moment, they're more ill than they would have been otherwise. Their prospects for recovery are actually lower. It's tragic and cruel.
Yeah, I always said that having that in the law made liars out of good mothers. You had to lie and make it sound imminent when you called. My last question is about the data that you're collecting. Where do you collect that data? Because that's one thing we are missing here in Minnesota, and we're trying to pass a law that the Attorney General would have a office that would collect the data from, and the counties must send it in rather than allow them to do it if they want to. How do you collect the data that you're using?
Yeah, well, one thing we are doing is collecting data on the number of involuntary removals and how many of them are directed by police and how many of them are directed by clinicians, right? We have 958, the law that lets clinicians do it, and 941, the law that lets cops do it. And so this is something that really amazingly has never been collected in New York City before. And so we started doing it even before the city council passed a mandate that says we have to report this data to them, which we're about to do. But it's something we're doing mainly through EMS, right? When they effectuate a removal and bring somebody to the hospital, it creates a medical record. And so we are having those counted and reported with some basic data, demographic data that gets collected as part of what EMS assembles in their report that they do on every person they bring to the hospital for any reason. When they're doing a 958 or a 941, we're having that also being sent to our Office of Community Mental Health, which is responsible for collecting that data. And we're seeing, we'll never be able to compare to what happened under previous administrations as far as the number of removals, but we certainly can see how we're doing from the years that we've been at this and whether the trend is going in the right direction.
So it's the
And
city that's collecting the data.
yeah, so right, so that's one part of it. The other thing I'll say is that, we're in the good position of having a city operated hospital system, which is able to collect data on what actually happens to people when they get to the hospital, rates of admission, lengths of stay, what kind of things we connect them to when they're ready for discharge. It's a bit of a black hole when people go to the private hospitals, which happens about 40% of the time. But for the 60% of cases that go to our city operated system, which includes really all the people that are on our top 50 list and that we're most concerned about, and the people that we're finding in the subways through the Scout and Path co-response teams, we're seeing a lot of really interesting data that we're making use of, and is informing our practice on how well people do there.
All right. Well, Brian, thank you. You're now officially a double friend of the podcast. We should start handing out jackets like on Saturday Night Live when people come.
What's the record? Who's got the most times on the show? Who am I shooting for?
I think most people.
2 is the top.
Dr. Laitman. We've had a few. We don't know.
3 or more?
Just
No.
2 times. There's nobody.
Oh, okay. So I'm tied for the record with Dr.
Yeah,
Laitman.
you're in the top. You're in the top 50.
Wow.
Brian, thank you so much for the courage and the passion and the tools to start to make very, very important changes in the mental health system. And we hope you'll come back again.
Thank you so much. I would be delighted to. And I so much appreciate what you do to get information to people.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches. You can help out the podcast and help others by sharing the podcast and by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts and or on YouTube. And remember, you can reach us at mindygreiling.com, randyk.com, or miriam-feldman.com.